Hey everyone, we're in conversation with Bruce Daisley. Bruce is a best-selling author. He's a technology leader from the UK. He spent 8 years as EMEA's vice president for Twitter, having joined that company in 2012. What I love most about Bruce, however, I would call him an organizational renegade. He's the author of The Joy of Work. And when I say renegade, I mean that in a good way, Bruce, because I think we're cut from the same cloth. Where I've been in my career, looking inside of it and then looking outside of it, I find that there's this strange consternation between the employee and the leader and the culture that's sort of manifested over the last decade or so. In so much as, again, my experience, but I'm curious, here's the question, right? What are we getting wrong inside of the organizations for so long? To write a book like The Joy of Work, which was outstanding, by the way, you've picked up on a whole bunch of trends and insights and just, things that just are, I guess, awry. So let's start there. What is the opposite of the joy of work? What's going wrong inside of it?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think from my perspective, I've worked at a lot of organizations that have had remarkable success. And I think what you recognize when you work in an organization that's been incredibly successful, it's that old perennial thing that when you get closer to the people at the top of any organization, the magic disappears a bit because you're witnessing firsthand. And so when you've worked in organizations that might be celebrated and that isn't a specific organization I'm thinking about, but you recognize that there's a lot of things that an organization can often thrive despite the leader rather than because of the leader. And
Right.
so, and that's not specifically to call out any organization. That's across a sort of my whole working career. And so once you recognize that, then you start thinking, oh, right. So workplace culture isn't this leader skill. It isn't this invention of remarkable people. It's almost a naturally occurring part of an ecology. Workplace culture sort of, yes, it can be fostered, yes, it can be delivered, nurtured, but also it can be self-propagating. And so once you recognize those things, then I became fascinated with those things. And what I found was that there are some workplace cultures that are often self-developing and self-sustaining that are just pleasurable to be part of. And there are some that are just exhausting and almost like there are layers within the organization that are intent on removing the joy and adding bureaucracy to work. And it became a fixation. There's a really interesting trend that's emerging right now where there's almost like, and it's a US thing, so it's not the invention of European socialists, but it's a US thing. This sort of anti-work ethos that's been sort of developing a little bit, and it's an interesting idea. This idea that work is so toxic that we must give it nothing of ourselves that they didn't pay for, and that we must detach ourselves from any fondness or affection for work. And what it fundamentally misses is, number one, we often get a lot of our sense of self from our work, a sense of identity from our work, and that work in itself can be a deeply satisfying thing. And so my particular interest is not necessarily savaging capitalism and saying that, we need to detach ourselves from any sort of emotional connection from our work, but rather more thinking, look, if we've got to earn a living, there's no shame in wanting to make that fulfilling, rewarding, and satisfying. So I think that's the fascination for me.
Do we, as the employee, then, whether you're a leader of self or a leader of people, is it incumbent upon us to identify first those virtues, those values, the id, the sense of meaning and purpose, or is it also incumbent upon the leaders inside the organization to help nurture that of said individual, or is it actually both? Like, where do you stand on something like that, Bruce?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the interesting things is in the last 20 years, ideas of purpose have been so strongly misappropriated that, look, most people, let's be candid about what people might be doing. They might be working at, a manufacturer of a product. So they might be actually some of the best work in the space has been done looking at people who work in retail stores. And I don't think we should presume that people should have to be a card-carrying loyalist for the organization they're working. But there is something innate about wanting to try to deliver a good experience. And look, you see it in retail. You see it really clearly in retail stores. People who work in a retail store, their inclination is, if they're given the resources to do it, if they're given the autonomy to do it, they want to try to create a good experience for their customers. And it's often the things that get in their way that make them give up on that objective. The bureaucracy, the layers of rules that prevent them from doing that. And I think, and so look, then let's extrapolate that to the rest of the workforce. A lot of us want to do a good job. No one sets about waking up in the morning thinking, I'm going to go and break some hearts today. I'm going to create some misery wherever I go. That's largely a learned thing, because if you think there's nothing I can do here, you become detached from any sense of wanting to do it well. So, for me, unfortunately, the ideas of mission and purpose have been appropriated by people who are trying to make us believe that we will change the world with the jobs that we do. When you see soap powder companies and they've told their workers, our mission is to bring happiness to, people around the world, because clean clothes is happiness. Like, come on, sometimes it doesn't have to be, for me, sometimes you don't have to create a lofty purpose. It can just be, we want to deliver a good product in an effective way. I sometimes think, the idea that you end up therefore with drink companies that are sort of, we're bringing happiness to families one sip at a time. Like, come on, it doesn't have to be this construction, this fairy tale to make people buy into wanting to create a good product. I think it can be simpler than that, is my take.
So then I guess, Bruce, is there any relationship between the culture of the organization, how people are treated, how the ecosystem ultimately manifests a way in which that people get their jobs done, and the so-called higher purpose or the purpose of the organization? Are they incongruent? Is there something to be learned between the two terms of culture and purpose? Where do you stand there?
Yeah, my belief is firmly that the way that you treat employees is a linear relationship with the way employees treat customers. Yeah. So firstly, I would say, and the best example I can give you of that is that next time you find yourself in a restaurant, watch the way that the servers are behaving, watch the way that the bar staff are behaving, and ask yourself what you think it would be like to work there. And normally you get a very clear, you can intuit a really clear sense. I can sort of see what it's like to work here. And, that's largely because that seems to be borne out in the evidence. There's a wonderful academic at Massachusetts Institute of Technology called Zeynep Ton, who focuses on retail stores. And she makes the point really clearly that, firstly, retail stores who give a good employee experience seem to have much lower employee turnover, fewer people quit, in other words. And in addition to that, they tend to have a much better experience, but those firms show higher profitability and they show higher growth than those who don't. It's sort of, all these things are part of a virtuous circle, because if you're not spending most of your year recruiting and training new workers, you pretty much remove a cost line from your organization. And those things most definitely apply in other sectors too. So we've seen, in those examples, retail and food service, but we witness this all over the place. When we give a good employee experience, it generally transfers into a good customer experience. The really interesting thing about that is that sometimes business school people or leaders don't necessarily see the advantage that good customer service affords as a competitive advantage. It sort of doesn't exist on a balance sheet for a lot of these people, missing something fundamental. I remember I've been in organizations where, when we were articulating our strategy for the next year, we said, look, we want to be famous for a level of customer service. And because it doesn't appear to be strategic, because it doesn't appear to be like a defendable difference, it's often met with scornful appraisal. And anyone who's been a customer will tell you that good customer service isn't something to be just scoffed at, dismissed, regarded as a triviality. It's often one of the things that it forges our emotional connection with organizations. So, I think, this is the critical thing for me. It's easy to dismiss good workplace culture, good customer service, but it often makes up the essence of why we choose certain companies to buy from and why we buy certain products, I think.
You've, like me, undoubtedly, for 2 years, sort of sat behind a screen, a webcam, a microphone, got out to the odd pub and have a beer or a pint every now and then. Here's the question for you. For 2 years, effectively, we've had two types of workers, right? We've had those that were allowed the opportunity to work from home because they are white collar or whatever you want to call them. They're, the new age role. And then you got frontline team members, whether it's healthcare, whether it is the grocers, whether it's the restaurants and so forth, whom have had to be in front of the virus, be in front of, the customer to serve. Now, the question here, Bruce, is because you're sort of like a cultural anthropologist. What's coming up next? I.e., will we be suffering from some sort of cultural demarcation going forward where, there's the lot of us that are still allowed to work from home, have that 4-day work week, the 2-3-2 model, et cetera. And then you still got frontline team members, healthcare or otherwise, whom have to be on site each and every day. What does your crystal ball tell you from what you've learned over the past 2 years about said culture, about the experience, about what it is that we should be really conjuring up in terms of how to effectively operate better?
There's a really interesting thing about that, isn't there? That we've most definitely got a hierarchy of what we consider to be of more value. So, I was chatting to a local practice doctor, and they were saying, look, the changes that we've enacted in the last 2 years, we probably should have done before. And so, some consultations on the phone, in fact, or some consultations on video call. Right. In fact, I spoke to someone the other day who said to me, it's really strange that we considered it a better experience to take a sick child on, whether it's in a car or on public transport, to be assessed. We considered that a better assessment than to put a sick child on a video call in first instance and then decide from there whether it was worth transporting them. But it's really strange. We've valued face-to-face so highly that we haven't necessarily assessed the true value of all of the offerings. Look, I think most definitely we're going to have in a whole layer of management a bias to face-to-face. And I think that's going to run through the organizational culture of a lot of organizations to the extent that we don't necessarily get a fair assessment of what works best. I think in the US, because of the way that geography works in the US, probably I suspect you're going to get a little bit more fully remote than you get in the UK. A lot of organizations in the UK are going to really push this 3 days or 4 days a week in the office model. I think my expectation is, and what I tend to do, I've run a newsletter and podcast where I basically just go through the latest data on these things week to week, and then have conversations with people, asking them what this looks like in their organization. And I've been chatting to a big retail bank here, and big retail banks probably, this is a lot of people who were bank tellers, a lot of people who were administrative, not necessarily the glamorous tech jobs that you might have thought would change. And yet you hear them describing the way that they are transitioning their work model. And you can't help but think, wow, this is firstly incredibly mainstream.
Yeah.
It's incredibly ambitious in the way they're setting about doing it. And they see it as, a fundamental renegotiation between the way that people did their work and the place that they did that work in. It's really interesting chatting to those people. One of the things that they first said to me was, we were certain there's one job that could never be done remotely, and that was call centers, telephone call centers. Right. Because call centers were the closest to They were the closest to sort of factories, really, that the knowledge work sector had. And yet, the biggest organizations I dealt with in terms of call centers told me that they were seeing between a sort of 10 and 15% productivity increase from people working remotely. And so they were like, well, it's a 15% productivity increase. It's a 15% cost reduction. We struggle to understand why we would go back to the way we were doing it before. Now that, for me, is so fascinating because it's very easy to style the changes to the workplace as being about the creative sector or the technology sector or jobs that don't necessarily look like the jobs that most of us do. Mm-hmm. And what you're finding is this is actually far more mainstream than we think. Now, I think as a consequence of that, there's big opportunities here. There's big opportunities for firms who say, actually, we do want to create an energized workplace culture, but we recognize we need to do it a very different way. Or organizations to say, we don't care about an energized workplace culture. We just want really productive workers. We're going to go fully remote, fully distributed. And there's big opportunities for, I think, a whole spectrum of different strategies here. Probably the worst placed organizations are the ones whose strategy here is tradition. Mm. Rather than starting with what our objective is or what our point of difference is, they're starting with the way we used to do things. And those organizations, I think, are going to have the hardest situation here. It's, that fortune's going to favor those who are candid, imaginative, and willing to ask themselves difficult questions. And I think, there's big opportunities for those firms.
It's funny you brought up call centers. In a prior life, I was chief learning officer for a big Canadian telecom called TELUS. And we, in 2010, Bruce, began the process of something we call flexible work styles. And we shifted 3,000 call center team members to be working 95% of the time from home. And they, in fact, had, and again, this still goes on today. I'm still on a retainer with TELUS doing great work with them, but they went on to, in comparison to their compatriots who were in an office, have a 15% higher engagement score. Their NPS or their customer sat scores were higher on average, and their psychological safety scores were through the roof in comparison, again, ironically, to those that were in the office. So I can attest to that firsthand, where you think about the relative potential inanity of a call center role. Some people think, and I think to myself, no, there's actually humanity behind that microphone or that telephone. And you can create the culture and allow for things to happen in a way that does create and manifest, a highly engaged and productive workforce, which is what I think everyone wants, because the outcome is the happy, retained customer who keeps coming back.
Yeah, look, so fascinating to hear that, because I think there's a lot of organizations, what I've heard, I was chatting to a chief exec last week, and the chief exec said, look, I don't know what you think the truth is, but here's the truth. In 2 years, we're going to be back to normal, 5 days a week in the office, and everyone will laugh about how this happened. And I said, look, a lot of respect for what you've accomplished, but I think you're 100% wrong, because, because I have witnessed, I've been to events when, we've sort of we haven't had a lot of time in the UK where people have gone back to the offices, but last September, October, I went to a couple of events in 2 weeks for big companies. Mm-hmm. And in one of them, the chief exec stood up and was saying something about, we're going to embrace flexible working going forward. That means you can have 1 day a week from, at home or somewhere else. And someone stood up, like a guy in his late 30s, and he said, look, we've had a record year in terms of the company success. Yeah. I've had a record year. I've had incredible success, but also I've had, through adversity, I've felt more connected to my family. And I've realized the way I was working before was unhealthy and unsustainable, and I'm not going back to it. So, I just want to put the company on alert that I think people like me have realized that we had things unbalanced before, and we are capable of doing our jobs in a more flexible way. Now, across the world, across like every job market, there are people who are saying that, saying, I've done really good work. I can prove I've done really good work. In addition, I've removed some of the stresses that were creating toxins in my life, and I'm not going back to the way things are. So this chief exec who said to me, oh, back to normal in 2 years. Well, you know for a fact then that chief exec will be maybe begrudgingly allowing some experiments, but have it really clear in his head that when we try these experiments, the conclusion is going to be, it didn't work. We're coming back. And so, but the strange thing is from that is I think you can make a decision that you'll be back in the office 5 days a week, but I think you're going to have to pay a very high premium to get workers to do that. Workers will do it. Some workers, younger workers might be more willing to do it, but you will have to pay a premium to get workers in the office 5 days a week.
So have we, as a result of the pandemic, many workers contemplating, their own life, their role, their organization, this contemplative kind of 2 years, have we entered perhaps arguably finally into the age of the employee, or is that run amok with sort of where your head is in the current state?
Yeah, well, most definitely, it's definitely a seller's market in the jobs market right now.
Nice.
If you've got any experience, if you've got any sort of value, largely you're able to look. You're able to take a pick of jobs far more than it has been recently. Remarkable, actually, because when we entered COVID, I think people believed that there was going to be off the charts unemployment and it was going to be economic ruin, and thankfully we're in a far different situation to that. So as a consequence of that, it is a time for people to think they aren't necessarily faced with financial ruin if they do want to optimize to support their family life, to support their the people around them. So it's I think it's a really interesting time. Age of the employee, I can most definitely see, in your words, I can most definitely see there's an argument for that to be said, for sure.
And I guess a couple of final questions. And first of all, thank you. This is so insightful. Is the executive got their head in the sand? That senior leader, the C-suite, like, do they not see the tsunami that is really there, which is the employee urging, begging, demanding that, really the workplace must change. And whether that's all the above, from culture to flexible work, to purpose, to how I'm being treated, to putting the customer first and working backwards. Like, where is your head in sort of thinking about where the executive's head is these days?
It's definitely mixed. I've seen some very progressive bosses, C-suite. One organization said to me, a very big British manufacturing firm said to me, they've been desperately trying to improve their culture for the last decade. And actually, this has been a catalyzing moment because it's enabled them to remove themselves from the wood paneled meeting rooms that they were having meetings in. And
I know exactly
it's enabled them
referring to.
Yeah. But, they were like, we realized more than anything ever before, our building was our culture. And we were trying to change the culture, and it was as simple as getting out of that building. So, they said to me a year into the pandemic, we're definitely never going back to that building. So interesting,
right.
That sometimes we can't necessarily see what the limiting factors are holding us back. And actually, when those things are revealed to us, we're like, wow, this is incredibly liberating. So, that chief exec was a real agent for change. I worked with another organization who was like, okay, if we, the mistake that we often make is reappraising, allowing the dust to settle around us, reappraising where we are and thinking, right, okay, I now get the measure of this. The way you might consider that right now, that metaphor is that, okay, people working 3 days a week in the office, 2 days a week at home is the way you might do it. He said, oh, but hang on, if I look down the road, well, what do we know? Hybrid working isn't the best of both worlds, it's the worst of both worlds. People traveling in to do video calls with colleagues who are at home will start getting frustrating. So he said, okay, so we know face-to-face has got a real value to it. And we know sometimes the way that hybrid works doesn't get that value. He said, I can see people maybe spending 1 day a week in the office rather than 3 days a week. And, once you're on 1 day a week, then it might be like, actually, it's 3 days a month, and actually, and he was like, okay, so my plan is, how do we become the only firm who are remote first in our sector? Because he said, right now, it's going to be such a big marketing point. If this is the way I can hire people, it's like, we're remote first. Go and move yourself to, that far-flung place that you've always dreamed of. As long as you can get back here, once a month, then we're in business. Right. So he was like, okay, and this is a chief exec. He's like, okay, so let's use this let's read the game. 4 moves on, everyone is going to be in this situation, whether that's right or not. It's like, and so let's jump there now. Now, for me, I love that, because whether that's right or wrong, it's someone who's trying to get ahead of these bewildering transformations that are taking place. And so that was, thrilling to work with them, because then you're like, okay, right, what does this look like? How can you use this as a way to market yourself to potential job applicants? And what are the pitfalls? What are the things you need to avoid? Because, maybe what we know is trust is easier to preserve face-to-face, although, most of us have managed for the last 2 years. So how do we build trust in this remote environment? It's just really interesting to watch the most progressive bosses really try and wrestle with those things, I think.
Wonderful example of exerting gumption as well. I find so many executives or leaders just sort of sit in their hands and are waiting for someone else to create the playbook. So wonderful. Thank you for that. Last one, which is really a segue from your anecdote there. What does the office have to become? So when you think about what was the Canary Wharfs, London town, like just the office, what do you think? What are you seeing, or what do you project to be kind of the physical makeup and the purpose of the office going forward?
Yeah, there's a workplace research organization called Leesman, and what they say is workplaces increasingly need to have a workplace why. What's the reason why people are coming together in them? So if you're traveling, now that you could do all your emails from home. You could do at least half of your meetings from home. You could get a lot of your inbox or your work done from home. And so the moment you get into your car or you step onto public transport, you're thinking, why am I going there? Really important. So, that workplace why, answering that workplace why becomes a really critical consideration. And I think, it's pretty clear that, look, if people are working remotely, then one of the things that might be valuable in the office is better audiovisual facilities. The boss wants to do the end of quarter presentation. Well, far better than him doing it from his desk in his spare room. He goes in, there's a nice studio, there's nice graphics. And so, it might well be that, okay, so we're going to have a nice audiovisual setup in the office. We're going to have great meeting facilities in the office, because we're going to bring people together for experiences rather than for emails. And so probably a higher spec office that is built around higher functionality for particular things. I think the office as well, if you think, what are the other trends that we see around us in business? Corporate social responsibility, and so companies thinking about how their office manifests their green footprint, how the office manifests their sustainability goals. So you can definitely see offices being far prouder of, all of our energy is renewable energy, all of our waste is handled in these ways. And these things, effectively, the office becomes, rather than just a place to go and do work, it becomes an embodiment of who our organization is. So, as people step into the building, they're reminded that all of the energy in this building comes from these places. Right. All of the timber in this building comes from these places. Why? Because it's actually now a sort of a place, a pin on the map that is a manifestation of that organization. And I think, that's an evolution of what we saw the office for. We saw the office as our desk and our telephone and our computer. Now the office is the embodiment in a world that's, virtual in so many ways. It's the embodiment of who our organization is in the world. And I think that's a really critical consideration. So look, it's about experiences. It's about answering that workplace why. It's about showing who we are in the world. I think these are really critical considerations going forwards.
Well, so long as there's no David Brents in the office going forward, we'll be all fine, right?
Michael Scott's, exactly.
Bruce, fantastic to chat with you. Thanks so much. The Joy of Work, which my father sent me, he lives near you up in Stratford upon Avon, is the sort of the English UK title. Tell us a bit about your newsletter, where we can reach out and find out more about you, and the North American title of the book.
Yeah, so the book in the US is called Eat, Sleep, Work, Repeat, which is the name of my podcast and website. Look, the book really was working at big technology companies. I realized the thing I said before was that we all are responsible to some extent in sort of shaping our workplace culture and shaping our experiences of work. So it was fascination with those things, really, and evidence-led fascination with those things. I loved a book a few years ago by the founders of Basecamp called Rework. And Rework was about 80 sort of spiky polemics, these angry editorials about, ASAP is toxic and you need to do this and do this. And I thought, if I go into my boss and say, hey, ASAP is toxic, my boss will sort of blink a few times and then, so what? So, the whole point of the book was, here are things that can improve our workplace, and here is the evidence behind them. So that was like the thinking behind that, sort of almost like a cookbook of workplace cultures, 30 recipes that you can do to try and improve your work. My newsletter really has just been documenting it over the last 2 years. It's just been documenting how work is evolving, some of these figures. I was dealing with a big bank an investment bank just before Christmas. And they said, we need everyone back in the office 5 days a week. Can you come and do a presentation why they need to be back? And I said, look, that's unfortunately not what I'm not in that business. But, and they came back to me a week later saying, you sure you won't do it? And I said, look, if you want someone to come in and present you the latest research about what the jobs market is saying about what employees expect, I can come and do that. And that's all I do with that newsletter. Try and track what research we're seeing, what the trends are, and try and help us make sense of it, because there's still so many firms saying, we've tried things and it's not working, or we'd love to know what people in our sector are doing. And that's my daily curiosity, really, trying to track what people in the sectors are doing.
Well, indeed, you are helping us mere mortals make sense of it. So, Bruce, thank you for this. Thank you for all that you're doing. I hope to do this again. And much luck with your future. Thanks, Bruce.
Thank you, Dan.